What's up, guys, and happy 1 year of the Cervantes Podcast. Wow. A year ago today, Monday, January 10th, 2021, is when I uploaded the very first episode of the podcast titled God's Plan, where I had a conversation with my god brother, Jordan. I'm really happy to see how much I've accomplished with this podcast in just a year. And it's honestly kind of crazy for me to even have a podcast because I never would have thought I would put myself out there on the internet with such vulnerable conversations pertaining to myself or the world at large. This is the 36th episode. I've interviewed 56 people, from entrepreneurs, musicians, actors, dancers, influencers, athletes, a model, a photographer, an educator, fellow YouTubers, a podcast host, and just amazing human beings all around. So shout out to all of the guests that have been featured and the people who tune in every week to listen. It was vital for me that with this podcast, I create a safe space for Black and Latino people to feel seen and heard, to have uncomfortable and unpopular conversations that affect our communities. I want to uplift Black and Latino people and show the world how beautiful and intelligent we are. Oftentimes, young Black and Latino voices are not heard, and I want to change that. This is a very small platform, but I hope it grows because even though it's self-titled, it's bigger than me, truly. Now to answer questions from TCP listeners and past guests, the first question is from Taylor, who was featured on episode 4, who asks, what have you learned in this last year? I've learned a lot. I've learned that time management is vital. I've learned that, you really have to plan accordingly, when it's my schoolwork, when I have to plan an episode, actually record extracurricular activities. Time management is really important. Sleeping, exercising, eating right, making sure that I'm waking up on time and going to class, doing my homework and studying and figuring all that out. That's very important. That's all time management. I also learned that this is a commitment. And while I am prioritizing this podcast, I have to make sacrifices. This podcast, being a content creator is not easy. So it's really important that, but I remind myself that this is what I'm passionate about. And sometimes I might not be able to go to that movie or go to a party or hang out with my friends as much as I used to. Like I have to, put the time and the effort in to make this podcast to be as best as it can be. And that even though I do have to make sacrifices, it's all worth it. So just reminding myself that I definitely learned that in this last year for sure. This next question is from Caitlin, who was featured on episode 18, who asks, what's the most unexpected thing you've learned while doing the podcast, from a guest or just the process itself? The most unexpected thing I've learned while doing this podcast, I would say, is when I got the chance to interview and speak to Brandon and Jasmine Laraquente. That was episode 16. And we spoke about, relationships and, their movie Saturday Morning. That was really unexpected because I never would have thought that, watching my favorite TV show a couple years ago, back when I was in high school, 13 Reasons Why, that I would actually get to interview and speak to and meet virtually a character from one of my favorite shows at the time. Like it was just such a crazy experience, and it was so easy getting them on the podcast. So that was really unexpected. Like I never would have thought that somebody, who has done such great things, Brandon and Jasmine, that want to come on my little podcast. So that was, that really meant a lot that they took the time out of their very busy schedule to sit down with me, and it 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 reaffirmed that even though this is a very small platform and I'm very new to this, that doesn't mean that my voice does not matter and that this platform is not necessary. Like my voice is necessary, and I should take myself seriously and not and I should take more risks. So I think that was the most unexpected thing, getting Brandon and Jasmine on the podcast, getting Mr. Morning, an educator all the way from Virginia, getting, Ahmed on the podcast, who was on the Ellen show and has, his own business, and now a Nat Geo explorer. So that's awesome. So yeah, that was unexpected thing. Some of the guests that I've been able to get has been very unexpected because I really thought that I was just gonna talk to friends and family. So the fact that I branched out of that is really cool. This next question is from Adriana, who was featured on episode 7, who asks, what are 3 things that you wish you knew before starting your podcast? The first thing I wish I knew was how important it is to plan when I'm going to interview someone and when I'm going to edit. That is really important because you don't want to get overwhelmed with, having to actually sit down and record the interview and then edit and then upload and promote your podcast and then also do all the other things you have to do. Like for me, it's, homework and studying and, I'm a part of 2 different clubs on campus. So making sure that I'm able to do all of that and not be late and not be behind on my work. So it's really important to plan out things for sure. If you're starting a podcast, planning out your content, when you're going to post and all those things. The second thing I wish I knew before starting my podcast is that social media algorithms change and that, now with Instagram, it's, smaller influencers and smaller content creators are getting the burden of not getting their posts seen as much by their followers. And it's more so, it feels as though the app is shifting and catering more towards celebrities and like bigger influencers. So I just have to work harder in promoting and marketing my podcast and maybe shifting to TikTok, which, there'll be more eyes on my content than Instagram. And yeah, so and realizing that not just using one social media platform, using a couple different ones so that you can get, as much eyes as possible. So I make sure to promote my podcast on Instagram, on Twitter, on Snapchat, and I think I'm gonna start promoting it on TikTok. The third thing I wish I knew was how time consuming having a podcast is. It definitely takes a lot of work. If an interview is maybe an hour and a half long, it's gonna take me about an hour and a half to edit, or maybe even more. So it's definitely time consuming, but it's all worth it for sure. She also asked, what advice would you give someone to start a podcast? I would definitely tell someone who wants to start a podcast to make a content calendar and really plan when you're going to interview guests if you do decide to do that. Planning out time to interview guests and planning out time to edit is really important. And I would also tell people who are interested in having a podcast that you should have pre-interviews with your guests so that both you and your guests are on the same page, and there's no confusion and the episode flows smoothly. I would say pre-interviews definitely help me, especially with like harder topics that I might not know much about. I want to make sure that my guests, has knowledge, has firsthand experience with whatever topic we're discussing. This next question is from Serena, who asks, how did you get started? So actually, my mom encouraged me to start a podcast in the summer of 2020 when I was switching my major from biology to television production. I was really nervous at first to start my podcast because I didn't know what my niche was going to be. I didn't know exactly what, because I noticed that, podcasts I listen to, there's like a niche, there's like one running theme. And for me, I don't necessarily have that, but I would say the running theme would be, my content, my podcast is geared towards Black and Latino people, and topics that affect us and things that affect us. So I guess that's sort of my niche. Um, but one of the best pieces of advice that someone told me was just do it, just get started. And then that really helped me because I was, I'm a perfectionist and I want everything to like look good and sound good and be perfect. But it's like, no, like you're not gonna know everything. It's not gonna be perfect at first. So if you just, practice and, in front of the other and just getting started and just doing it for sure. And you will figure it out. Because at first I didn't know what I was doing, and now I am very, I feel comfortable in what I'm doing. So that definitely helped me for sure. She also asks, what platform do you use to make your podcast? So I edit my interviews on iMovie. And what's nice about iMovie is that it's free to use. And when I got my MacBook and whatever Apple device that you purchase, iMovie comes with it. So that's really cool. So I use iMovie to edit all my interviews. This next question is from Rachel, who was featured on episode 27, who asks, where do you see the podcast in 1 year? In a year, I see the Cervantes podcast maybe being filmed in person. I think that would be really fun and might make the conversation more interesting for my audience. I think that, these Zoom interviews are cool, but I think it's gonna make it more interesting, I think, for sure, if I interview people in person. So yeah, I definitely see it. I see that in the future. She also asks, who would be your dream interview? So this is a really good question. These two people that I would love to interview if I ever got the chance, and I would be honored to get the chance to speak to them. They have been interviewed a lot, many times. We know them, we see them, they're very popular, but I really do think I could come up with some good questions for them, for sure. So these two people would be President Barack Obama and Beyonce. I have so many questions that I would ask them. Yeah. So hopefully that happens one day. She also asks top 3 favorite podcast episodes. It changes for me sometimes, but I would say right now my top 3 favorite episodes would definitely have to be episode 16 with Brandon and Jasmine Laraquente, episode 32 with Everything Omega, and episode 24 with Ahmed Muhammad. Those 4 people were really nice to speak to. I think we had great conversations with Brandon and Jasmine. I feel like I, saw like a different side of them that people may not know. And I'm really excited for their movie to come out. With Everything Omega, she was just a breath of fresh air. She's really funny, and I think we had a really good conversation about body positivity and just her journey, being a model and being a singer-songwriter. So it was really nice getting to meet her. And Ahmed, I'm really proud of him. I think that it's it's amazing, but it's also a little unfortunate that he was the first Black valedictorian at his high school. But I'm really proud of him. He just recently became a National Geographic Explorer. I'm really proud of Kids Cubed, his business. His organization, I should say. So I'm really proud of him, and I think he's going to do a lot of great things. So those are my 3 favorite episodes: episode 16, 32, and 24. The final question I received from you guys is from Sydney, who asks, how have you grown as a result of starting/running the podcast? This is a really good question. Wow. Since starting this podcast, I think I've really grown in my people person skills. A lot of my past guests, I did not know them prior to speaking to them on the podcast. And it's interesting because before I even started this podcast, I didn't really speak to strangers. I really just, I don't know if it's like me being a New Yorker, but I really just kept to myself and just, spoke to people that I already knew or already were friends or related to. So I'm really glad that I pushed myself out of my comfort zone and reached out to people and spoke to people about topics that I feel passionate about or want to learn more about, and I think when I didn't know someone and I was having them on the podcast, I think it made me ask better questions. And I think it made the episode better, as opposed to perhaps when I did my quarantine convos Instagram live series. Yeah, I spoke to people that I was friends with or was related to, and it made the conversation much more easier, much more safe. But when I, branched out of that, and talking to different people, I think it made the questions and the episodes just so much better, and this podcast so much better because I'm really getting out of my comfort zone. So yeah, I think that's what I learned. So that's it for all the questions. Thank you guys for submitting them. Those are really good questions. I really appreciate you guys submitting them. Thank you to all the listeners, my family and friends for embarking on this journey with me. I have a lot of great things in the works. And I'm really excited for what's to come in this new year in 2022. I hope you all have a great week. And as always, thank you for listening.